battlefield? What does my status yield in this society? Will it gain me notoriety, or will they lie to me?
The Civil War was a pageantry of so many extreme emotions and passions. It was, in many people's view, the defining moment of what it is to be an American. For many of us in Minnesota, there's a sense that that was an experience that really wasn't a part of me. And so I find that the stories of those who hadn't had a voice in the past to be compelling and probably more relevant to most people who don't feel like they have a voice.
We are the sons of freedom.
Rather than being seen as passive participants in their own history, now scholars are starting to really portray these African Americans as very active and dynamic participants who move their status forward through distinct action, including sacrificing their own lives on the battlefield.
The stories of how black men in Minnesota came to wear the Union blue speaks to the meaning of service to a nation that didn't always serve you.
Of the hard-to-find history of marginalized communities and the ways history connects us all.
These are some of the Civil War stories of Minnesota's black pioneers. We are the sons of freedom.
North Star Civil War Stories is a TPT Partnerships co-production with the Ramsey County Historical Society and Twin Cities PBS.
We are the sons of freedom.
This program was made possible by funds provided by the state of Minnesota through the Minnesota Historical Society from the Arts and Cultural Heritage Fund.
At the onset of the Civil War, black men weren't seen as having the character, courage, or capability to fight for their freedom.
The Union Army generals and the politicians' original stance on black participation in the Civil War was to bar it.
Lincoln's Emancipation Proclamation set the stage for African Americans to join segregated units. But why risk it when the war was well underway?
It makes sense, therefore, for African American men who weren't expected to fight to just sit back and let it happen. And I think a lot of society expected blacks to sit back. It became critical for African Americans precisely for that bias that they knew existed in society, that it wasn't just an issue of becoming free. So when an African American signed up to fight, what he was doing was laying the groundwork for a future that he hoped would be governed by dignity and respect.
The Brooklyn Township Historical Society created a detailed chronicle of the residents from the suburban community who fought in the Civil War.
The list is titled Roll of Honor, List of the Patriots of Brooklyn who enlisted for the suppression of the Great Slaveholders Rebellion. They didn't call it secession. It wasn't a civil war. It was a rebellion of the slaveholders. I came to this soldier named Stephen Dutton, and when I went to look to see what regiment he was in, it said 57th Colored Infantry. That really grabbed me. We do know that he was a slave in Alabama. He escaped. Somehow he was able to make his way up to Minnesota. He received a town bond for $225, or in other words, a bounty, to enlist with Brooklyn Township as his home.
Late in the war, with casualties mounting, it was hard to find men to enlist. So to avoid a draft, communities would offer a bounty to volunteers.
Because he was willing to enlist, towns were fighting for him and they were actually bidding for him. And he actually took a lesser amount because a soldier from Brooklyn Township, his name was Thomas Green, with the 3rd Minnesota Infantry Regiment. And in '64, he became an officer in a colored regiment. And he enticed Stephen Dutton to enlist from Brooklyn Township and be a part of his 57th U.S. Colored Troop. So that was the connection of Stephen Dutton to Brooklyn Township.
Offered up a bounty for the volunteers. Only way to be a patriot was be a pioneer.
So the 57th U.S. Colored Infantry was stationed in Arkansas, mostly in Little Rock. For the most part, they were on guard and garrison duty. although they did fight in a few skirmishes. So we know that he came back to Minnesota in 1865.
With his army pay and his bounty, Dutton bought land and was listed in the 1870 census as the only African-American farmer in Minneapolis. The black veteran would see himself reflected in the diverse community Old Brooklyn Township has become.
Well, we have a large Liberian population in Brooklyn Center and Brooklyn Park. And of course, the reason why they're here today is because of the Civil War in Liberia. And it was very important for me to get these books into the schoolrooms, into the classrooms.
Despite his continued research, Daryl Sanders has not yet found Dutton's final resting place.
So he's in an unmarked grave somewhere, and I've been looking for him for 10 years.
Well, it would be wonderful, of course, if we had diaries and memoirs and other kind of documents of those 100-plus black men who had participated in the Civil War and who were Minnesotans or who ended up in Minnesota.
Without a grave marker or personal accounts, Dutton at least now has an honor for his service inspired by the American Revolution.
So they thought that anyone who was going to fight to preserve the Union should be again called a patriot.
This land in Stearns County, Minnesota, has been in the same family since the 1850s. This place symbolizes the story of immigration and building the American dream, but it's also a part of Minnesota's Black Civil War story.
Herman Schaefers is my great-grandfather who had immigrated from Hagensdorf, Germany in 1855 with his family. He got drafted for the Civil War, and so he ended up walking from Roscoe, Minnesota to Fort Snelling to sign up, and that's over 100 miles.
Both the North and the South allowed men who were drafted to hire substitutes to serve for them.
Family story was that Herman was at Fort Snelling and that an African-American young man came up to him and said, "I'll go in your place." The other part of the story was that this young gentleman ended up dying in the war.
I ended up at the Historical Society and I told them the story, and the person there said, well, we can just pull the muster records. And I start paging through the ledger and see finally an entry, Dixon William, and that he went as a substitute for Herman Schaefers. And this was just incredibly moving because it went from this story to a person. We knew that he was from Tennessee. We know that he was 5'4".
18 years old.
18 years old. That he was mixed race. He was mulatto, was listed on it. So it became this person.
At this point, the Schaefers haven't found any photos of William Dixon. But the more they lift him up and say his name, the more Dixon gets back his own agency, humanity, and manhood.
His willingness, his bravery in going south down that river, we just empathized with him and we cared about him. We wanted his story to be remembered.